So I'm sure many of you have had a music history course at some point during your schooling career where you talked about big major composers and eras of music history and whatever. But I'm sure what your teachers never told you was the actual fun parts of music history. And I wanted to share with you today one of my favorite stories from music history, and that is the War of the Romantics. Now, that sounds really weird in its name because it's not actually a war and doesn't involve any weapons, but it involves some nasty words. So before I actually get into the nitty-gritty details, I need to give you some context as to what's going on. Romantic music in music history came from classical music. One of the major people that helped that transition from one point to the next was Ludwig van Beethoven, which you've definitely heard of before. He helped take music from this light, fluffy, classical sound to this dark and heavy romantic sound. Because romantic doesn't mean lovey-dovey romance, it means this dark, deep, depressing, dramatic sound that a lot of composers start to write throughout this era. Now, of course, with any new era in a music history or new genre that's being created, new discussions are started as to what that means for how the music is supposed to be defined. And one of the biggest ones that started coming out during this time is music supposed to stand for something, or can it just kind of be on its own? One of these people who said that music should stand for something was Franz Liszt, who created this idea of symphonic poems, which basically just means that the music is supposed to create this story or tell this message through its music. It's supposed to represent something, basically. But he also acknowledged it didn't have to do that all the time. But people became enamored with this idea. However, this may also be due to the fact that Franz Liszt had this crazy mob of people who were literally obsessed with everything he did. Ever heard of Listomania? Yeah, this is where it comes from. On the other hand, you have composers like Robert Schumann, who didn't really stand for anything initially, but we'll get to that in a second. Robert Schumann, on the other hand, created his own music magazine called the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, which is just the new magazine for music. But in this magazine, he wrote many different articles about new composers of the time, new music that was being written, and he talked about various things. One of the people he did actually end up talking about was Franz Liszt, where he wrote a pretty positive review of his music at that time. However, this is not always going to be the case, because even though he created this magazine in 1834, he decided to resign as the chief editor of this magazine. The next editor to come in was Franz Brendel, who would completely change the magazine. So Franz Brendel really loved Franz Liszt and all of his music that he wrote, and he would just talk him up and talk him up and talk him up. And this idea of what was called program music. Remember the music I was talking about before? Music that was supposed to represent something? The term for that became known as program music. So he talked up this idea of Franz Liszt and program music, and he started talking up this school that also loved Franz's ideas at the expense of Robert Schumann, the original editor of this magazine. So needless to say, Schumann was not too happy about this and was kind of ticked off about the whole thing. But, he tried to smooth things over a little bit. He had been friendly with Liszt in the past. Liszt had actually supported his controversial marriage between him and Clara Schumann. So, it wasn't a thing to directly take out on Liszt itself, until we get to the infamous dinner party. So in June 1848, Franz Liszt, who toured around many different cities, was touring around Dresden at the time, which was the city that Robert and Clara lived in. So the pair of them decided to throw this dinner party in Franz Liszt's honor. And you have to think about the fact of how much effort a dinner party like this takes in 1848, with none of the modern conveniences. So Clara went through the whole pain of setting this whole thing up, and they have the date set, the time set, and everybody shows up, and who is not there? Franz Liszt, the guest of honor. So they continue on with the party, and they throw the party as usual, they have the food, and they're playing some music, and they're in the middle of Beethoven's D major trio, 2 hours into the party, and Franz Liszt finally shows up. But he doesn't show up alone. He shows up with Richard Wagner, who wasn't even invited to this party. And not only that, they show up in the middle of a piece. And if you don't know anything about music etiquette, especially classical music etiquette, you do not walk in while a piece is being played. You wait till the end to interrupt things. You do not walk in the middle of somebody's performance. So that happens, and then Robert Schumann decides to play one of his own compositions for Franz Liszt. Franz listens to the whole big thing and finally at the end says, it's okay. It sounds a little Leipzigerish, which was his kind of own personal way of saying it sounds like it's from Leipzig and it's really old and old-fashioned, which ticked Robert off. But of course, he's suppressing it down, he's letting it go, it's fine. But not only that, Liszt then begins to praise Meyerbeer, another composer at the time, at the expense of Schumann's friend, Mendelssohn. And it would be fine, sure, you're dissing this guy's good friend, but Mendelssohn had just died about 5 or 6 months earlier. This guy was barely dead for a year and he's already making fun of him at this party, whose host is good friends with the guy and is probably still upset about the fact that he's dead. So needless to say, Robert freaks out. So he gets up, runs across the room, grabs Liszt by the shoulders, shakes him back and forth and says, "How dare you speak about Mendelssohn that way?" Then after doing this, he's just had enough and he stomps out of the room, leaving everyone to just glare at Liszt, who has just been the entire time. So Liszt is trying to play this whole thing off, and he turns to Clara, Robert's wife, and he says, "Tell your husband he's the only person who would take those kind of words so calmly." Then he walks out of the party, and it's just, at this point, the party's just over. So then Clara, who is the only person with any kind of stability left at this point, who has put in all this effort, who has just had her husband insulted, who's probably had her friend insulted too, I'm sure she was good friends with Mendelssohn, and just had this awful person just bust in this door and ruin this good party, she just is like, I am done with him forever. And oh my gosh, she held that grudge till the day Liszt died. Because the thing about Liszt is, even if he didn't necessarily like somebody, he still respected them as a composer and still had this appreciation for this music and would still work with them professionally, whether he liked somebody or not. So it's really hard to tell if he just genuinely didn't like the Schumanns, or if he just decided to be really rude one day or whatever, because he was still pretty cordial with them after the fact. But the Schumanns were not, and Clara especially so. In fact, it's been found that Clara wrote in her diary when she found out that Liszt died, she was basically kind of like, good riddance. But the story doesn't stop there. We actually have to go to another composer who is really good friends with the Schumanns, and that is Johannes Brahms. Now, Johannes Brahms was kind of a late bloomer in terms of composers go. He wasn't really discovered until later in his life, and when he was discovered, it was by Robert Schumann, which is how they became really good friends. But before that actually happened, he did meet Liszt first. But the thing to know about Brahms is he was an incredibly shy man in person. He really kept to himself, and he was just really afraid to push himself out there, which is probably why he started up so late. But there was one day when Brahms and Liszt were in the same city, and Liszt came over to see Brahms, and he was kind of like, "Hey, will you play some of your pieces for me?" And Brahms was just, he could not do it. He was just way too shy. He was like, no, I can't do this. No, I really don't want to. So Liszt was like, fine, I'll do it myself. So Liszt sits down with Brahms' music, and he kind of shows off a bit and just kind of casually sight reads through Brahms' music, kind of showing him up in the process. Not to mention that, but this is also it wasn't just the two of them alone. There was a group of people around, which is probably, again, why Brahms didn't really feel like playing this piece. So after Liszt had showed up Brahms at this point, he then played one of his own pieces, one that he had just written and really held near and dear to his heart. But as he was going about and playing this song, he finished the piece only to turn around and find that Brahms had fallen asleep. And so Liszt kind of took offense to that. It was one of his more favorite pieces that he had written, and Brahms had fallen asleep in the middle of it. Now, I'm sure he didn't really mean anything by it, but Liszt was kind of mad about that fact. You know how Liszt was super professional with other people he usually interacted with? Brahms was the one exception to this rule, and it may have been due to this little weird interaction they had with each other. But of course, because of this, because Liszt has his own posse, that kind of meant that Brahms got kicked out of that side of the group of the popular musicians of the time. And then of course, because he was then found by the Schumanns, who at this time didn't really like Liszt anymore, Brahms automatically got shooed in with the other side of the program music to the absolute music, or the music doesn't have to represent anything. We don't want anything to do with those people over there. Well, we have our two parties now. We have program music, which is music that is supposed to represent something or show an idea or paint a picture or just supposed to do something. And absolute music, which is music doesn't have to mean anything at all. And the thing is, this was not a new argument at the time. People had been arguing this for years and years and decades up until this point. It's just that more tension was created when you involve the magazine that was originally started by Robert Schumann, when you involve the mania that came up behind Franz Liszt, and the third and final incident I'm about to tell you. So enter Joseph Joachim. So he was a young up-and-coming violinist who was super talented, and who Liszt asked him if he would work for him. The thing was, Joachim didn't really like working under Liszt, and he especially did not like the music that Liszt was making. But for some reason, he continued working for him for 7 whole years. Finally, at some point, he just decides he's had enough, and he talks to his friend Brahms, who we talked about earlier, and says, look, I can't stand this Liszt guy. I can't stand his music. I really don't like what he stands for. I don't like his program music. I much rather prefer the more traditional and conservative, absolute music, and I can't stand it. So Brahms tells him, you need to go to the German press, and you need to write about your experience with Liszt, and you need to kind of expose him. So he and Brahms get together this group of people, and they write this manifesto about why this kind of music is bad, and why that people shouldn't respect them as much as they are. And I'm going to read it to you here. All right, let me read. The undersigned have long followed with regret the pursuits of a certain party whose origin is Brendel's Zeitschrift für Musik. That's Robert's magazine again. The above journal continually spreads the view that musicians of a more serious endeavor are fundamentally in accord with the tendencies it represents, that they recognize in the compositions of the leaders of the group works of artistic value, and that altogether, and especially in northern Germany, the contentions for and against the so-called music of the future are concluded, and the dispute settled in its favor. To protest against such misrepresentation of the facts is regarded as their duty by the undersigned, and they declare that, so far at least as they are concerned, the principles stated by Brendel's journal are not recognized, and that they regard the productions of the leaders and the pupils of the so-called New German School, which in part simply reinforces these principles in practice, and in part, again, enforce new and unheard of theories as contrary to the innermost spirit of music, strongly to be deplored and condemned. Signed, Johannes Brahms, Joseph Joachim, Julius Otto Grimm, and Bernhard Schulz. So basically, what that means is they were sick and tired of all this stuff being put out by Robert's former magazine about how Liszt and his friends are so great and that any other way of writing music is dumb and conservative and boring and old and just you shouldn't do it. This was also taken up by a local music conservatory at the time who also kind of pushed these ideas. Franz Liszt didn't really have anything to do with it, but because he was kind of the figurehead that was put up on this pedestal by all these music writers and journalists, These people had had enough, and Joachim especially had had enough of Liszt's music because he just didn't really like it. So they put out this whole big manifesto. The problem was they were trying to circulate this around to get as many signatures on this as possible, and it was found by the magazine before it officially ever got published. So what did the magazine do? They posted their own parody version of it with other people making fun of it and signing their names on it, and published that in the magazine before the manifesto ever really got out. So that kind of ruined any momentum this group would have had, and it just really made them look bad. And of course, that's really where the story ends. It doesn't get any better from that. There was just people talking back and forth as to what's the right way and what's the wrong way, and what do you think of this and what do you think of that. And a lot of this was just fueled on by bitter rivalries between these people, and just complete and utter grudges felt by these people for no real apparent reason. But it is such dramatic trash, and that is why I love this story so much. So I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it and doing research and reading on this lovely topic yet again. And I hope you learned something today. Thanks for watching.